Hello. I'd like to start by showing you some basic differences between 2D and 3D layers. I know we've been working with 2D layers for the length of the class and we just barely scratched the surface of the 3D 2.5D world that After Effects offers us, and so I wanted to make that a little bit more clear because we really breezed through this on our last lecture. For the purposes of this, I am going to use these two text layers that I've created inside After Effects. As you all remember, we were able to create text by simply choosing the text tool, which is up on the menu at the top, or Control T is the shortcut to get to it, or you simply click on that particular tool, and then you're allowed to click and type inside the composition. Let me press the V key to return to my selection tool, and as you noticed, I have named each one of them top layer and bottom layer accordingly. Now, in the 2D world, we're able to scale, rotate, or move this by any number of ways. We can go ahead and reveal the properties of a layer. So let me select the top layer, for example. Now press the P for shortcut for position. If I scrub the numbers left or right, as I increase it goes down, as I decrease it goes up. Let me undo that. And these two sets of numbers indicate X and Y axes in the particular property. So 620 right now, the value of 620 is the value that is given to the X axis to that particular layer. If I decrease it, it goes to the left, meaning it's decreasing in value. If I scrub it to the right, as I click and drag, it will scrub the value up and it will move my layer to the right, which indicates that if I increase the value on the x-axis, my position changes to the right. You can also scale by using or you can also move the layer, by clicking and dragging on it in the composition window interactively. Same thing applies for scaling or rotation properties. So for example, if I want to change the scaling value, let me keep that layer selected and I'll press the S key to call its S property, its scale property. By default, the layer is at 100%, but if I scrub the value of that layer, of that property, it will increase the size, or it will decrease the size if I go below 100%. If I go negative, it will flip the layer over and it'll start increasing in size, but in the negative value. Let me undo that. You notice that I only clicked and dragged one of the values and it did increase the value of both. And that is because to the left of that particular set of numbers, X and Y scale, there's this little link. And that link constrains the proportions of the layer by allowing me to simply increase the value of one and the other one will follow as if it was a child. If I deselect that link and I click on one of them, I am allowed to transform that specific axis value. As you guys can see, I'll just undo and I'll select them to keep them together. I can also rotate by pressing the R key to call the rotation shortcut, the rotation property, of that particular layer. And I can click and drag and scrub the values to rotate accordingly. Now, I can also rotate by using the rotation tool, which is this tool up at the top in the toolbox, in the tool menu. The shortcut for that tool is the W key on the keyboard. So if I press the W key and I click interactively, I can scrub the value and rotate interactively if I want to do that. I can also scrub the value of the number in its property window and it will do the same thing. Very good. Now, so far this is not new to you guys. Everything that we've covered so far is basic properties on any of the layers that we've created in any of the compositions inside After Effects. You also remember that the stacking order means that whatever is on top, in this case the top layer, it appears to be on top of whatever happens to be below it on the stacking order in the timeline. So if I move let me switch back to my selection tool by pressing V, and if I drag that top layer down, it appears to be on top of the bottom layer. In the past, to be able to switch the position, not in the past, in the 2D world, to switch the position of those two layers, I would have to just change the stacking order in the timeline by simply clicking and dragging one on top of the other. So I'm going to click and drag the top layer below the bottom layer, and once I move the top layer down below, now it appears to be behind the bottom layer. Now this is just stacking order in the timeline, like we've said. With the introduction of 3D, now we have the ability to truly move things into space. And the effect that gives us is the effect of scaling things, because they get smaller or bigger as we move forward, closer to the camera, or further away from the camera. So how do we do that? Well, let me go ahead and switch my my modes window to switches by clicking on the bottom button, or if I have my shortcuts activated, I can press F4 on the keyboard. So either clicking on this button bottom inside the timeline, below the timeline, I'm sorry, or pressing the F4 key allows me to go back to my switches window. And then in the switches window, it is simply applying this particular switch, turning on that switch that allows me to turn the layer into a 3D layer. So let me go ahead and select the top layer, and I'll call the position property for it. I'll select the bottom layer, call its position property, and then I'm going to switch both of them on. And you'll notice that now we have a lot more values that appear inside that particular layer, because the layer is now treated as an actual 3D layer. It applies things. Now instead of having X and Y only in the position values, I have X, Y, and the third value is Z. Z appears as a 0 because that is the 0 point as default in any layer that it gets turned into a 3D layer in After Effects, in any composition. Now this 0 point, it's with reference to where in the world that particular layer is in the Z-axis. Z-axis, like we explained in class, is the distance from or to the camera. So if I move the values towards the camera, I am moving towards the camera. Literally, what you're looking at right now is a camera looking at those two layers. Now, someone asked me, I don't see a camera in the composition. The truth is that the camera is a default camera once you turn on the camera, or once you turn on, I'm sorry, the 3D, the layers into 3D layers. You'll notice that this item right here says active camera, and that is because it allows you to switch between different cameras for the view on what you're looking at. Now I am looking at the front view of my 3D world. If I go left, I am switching and I'm looking at the layers from the left hand side. Now you'll notice that they're flat, and that is because, like I said, except for true 3D items that you would bring in from like Cinema 4D or OBJ objects that you bring in through other third-party plugins, every object that you create in After Effects or that you import into After Effects is truly a 2D object. It's, for all intents and purposes, a rectangle, and as such, it doesn't have any depth. But think of them as sheets of paper that you can push into space and that you can rotate, just like the example that we saw in class. Let me go back to my active camera, and now I'm looking at what I had set up. Now, right now, the top layer on the stacking order, the top layer appears to be on top of the bottom layer. So if I move by constraining my motion to the axis, notice that when I roll over that gizmo that appears on the 3D layer, I see the green arrow, the red arrow, and a blue arrow, which we don't see because we're looking straight onto it. But just like we see the red and green, there's a blue arrow down here. The green arrow represents the y-axis, the red arrow represents the x-axis, and the blue arrow represents the z-axis. So if I'm going to move this down on the y-axis, simply roll over that green arrow, click and drag, and you'll notice that I am constraining my motion to the y-axis. You'll notice that if I let go, I am on top of that. One layer is on top of the other. The top layer is on top of the bottom layer. Now, if I move the stacking order in the timeline, I'm going to move the bottom layer to the top of the layer, of the top layer. Now the bottom layer is on top of the top layer. You'll notice that both of them happen to be at the 0 point on the z-axis. Now, with the bottom layer on top of the top layer, I am going to push the bottom layer to the back by increasing its value on the z-axis for the position. So I'm going to click in scrub, and you'll notice that even though I'm increasing the value on the z-axis for position, even though the bottom layer is on top of the top layer in the timeline, it appears behind in the z-axis. And that is because once the layers get turned into 3D, they cease to obey the logic of the stacking order. Now, the beautiful thing about this 2.5D approach that After Effects has is that you can go ahead and mix 2D and 3D layers together. The only difference is that the 2D layers on the stacking order will always appear on top of whatever 3D layers you have if they are on top of them in the timeline. So for example, let me go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to click and I'm going to write topmost on this one. And I am not going to turn this one into a 3D layer. You'll notice that the topmost layer is still a 2D layer. If I call its position window, I only have 2 values for it. And in the stacking order, it happens to be, in the timeline, it happens to be at the top of everything. When I drag it down, it's on top of both of those 2 layers. But if I drag down that layer behind to the bottom, it becomes the backmost layer in the composition. And even if I were to, let's say for example, let me turn off the visibility of the bottom layer so that we don't see it anymore. If I move the top layer, the white layer, to try to push it on the z-axis behind that 2D layer, I can never get past it because the 2D layer does not obey the 3D world. The z-axis does not exist for that topmost layer. For the 2D layer, it does not exist. However, if I turn it into a 3D layer, now my top layer is behind because I just turned the topmost layer into a 3D layer, and by default it has a value of 0 on the z-axis. But for the top layer, I had just switched its value for the z-axis to 914. Therefore, that actually obeys the distance, meaning the actual space, and as I'm actually pushing it out into space or bringing it towards the camera. Now, I keep on saying bringing it towards the camera, but I haven't shown you how that works. Let me go ahead and make this 50% so you can see what happens when I change the position from positive to negative in the z-axis. So I'm gonna make it now negative, and now it's negative 640, 750, and it's getting closer to the camera. That said, there's an actual camera that's looking at that layer, and the camera is exactly where I'm looking at it from. This camera by default happens to be around negative 1800 pixels away, or negative 1800 units away from the actual layers that you are creating. So if I say that, if I were to type in on the z-axis value for position for top layer, negative 1800, I should see that layer disappear because it's just past the lens. Now let me make it, meaning it just went behind the camera. Now let me make it negative 1700, and it should appear again into the screen ever so slightly. Let me go in, and there it's appearing right now. It's about 1400 pixels right now. So you'll notice that I am going right, the layers going right below the camera, as you can see. Point being is that you can control the position of these layers, or the rotation, or any of the properties. Now that it's applicable in 3D space, you can go ahead and work it. Something that is more related to space than time, because things like transparency and such, they can work the same way in both 2D and 3D. Hopefully this clarifies the concept of 2D versus 3D layers and how we can manipulate it, and it gives you the first look into how we can combine both 2D and 3D layer properties, number one, and second, how we can control the new dimension that we are adding to any of these layers by turning them into 3D layers. I will see you soon.